And yet we continue to send more troops over there. In Watts, in L.A., there was a huge race riot that left 34 dead, and much of the city was burned and looted. In the Northeast, there was a blackout over multiple states and Canada that lasted 13 and a half hours. The Gateway Arch in St. Louis was finished that year. 1965 was also the year when the Voting Rights Act was passed, in which a guarantee that African Americans had the right to vote became law. That was the year when the Gemini space program got heated up and eventually led to a manned mission to the moon. That was also the year of the Palm Sunday tornado outbreak that left across the Midwest 256 people dead and 1,500 people injured because of the widespread tornadoes. Days of Our Lives debuted in 1965. Days of Our Lives, and the most popular movie, Dr. Zhivago. Ranger 8 moon mission took place that year, and also a comet was seen. It had a name that I can't pronounce. Civil rights marches were taking place in the South and in Alabama on a regular basis, led by Martin Luther King. And again, there was a strong anti-Vietnam sentiment in our country during that time. 1965, Paul Harvey was a popular radio broadcaster, and many of you listened to him on a daily basis back then. I want to read you today a transcript of one of his radio broadcasts. I did that about a month ago, and we spent some time talking about that. This one comes at it from a little different angle, but again, Paul Harvey, a Christian, a believer himself, read this on the air, and it caused a major stir nationwide. And I want you to listen carefully to the words of this transcript, because they will lead us into the subject today, which is about a friend of mine who is afraid for herself and for her kids about the world that we live in, afraid to send them to school, afraid just of the growing hostility in our world, the sentiment of hatred and fear, and really an anti-God sentiment. Anyway, listen to what Paul Harvey said on the air in 1965. 1965. If I were the devil, if I were the prince of darkness, I'd want to engulf the whole world in darkness, and I'd have a third of it, its real estate, and 4/5 of its population. But I wouldn't be happy until I had seized the ripest apple on the tree, thee. So I'd set about, however necessary, to take over the United States. I'd subvert the churches first. I'd begin with a campaign of whispers. With the wisdom of a serpent, I would whisper to you as I whispered to Eve. Did God really say that? Do as you please. To the young, I would whisper that the Bible's a myth. I would convince them that man created God instead of the other way around. I would confide that what's bad is good and that what's good is square. And the old, I would teach to pray after me, Our Father, which art in Washington. And then I'd get organized. I'd educate authors in how to make lurid literature exciting so that anything else would appear dull and uninteresting. I'd threaten TV with dirtier movies and vice versa. I'd peddle narcotics to whom I could. I'd sell alcohol to ladies and gentlemen of distinction. I'd tranquilize the rest with pills. If I were the devil, I'd soon have families at war with themselves, churches at war with themselves, and nations at war with themselves, until each in its turn was consumed. And with promises of higher ratings, I'd have mesmerizing media fanning the flames. And if I were the devil, I'd encourage schools to refine young intellects, but neglect to discipline their emotions. Just let those run wild until before you know it, you'd have to have drug-sniffing dogs and metal detectors at every schoolhouse door. 1965. Within a decade, I'd have prisons overflowing. I'd have judges promoting pornography. Soon I could evict God from the courthouse, then from the schoolhouse, and then from the houses of Congress. And in his own churches, I would substitute psychology for religion and deify science. I would lure priests and pastors into misusing boys and girls and church money. If I were the devil, I'd make the symbols of Easter an egg and the symbol of Christmas a bottle. If I were the devil, I'd take from those who have and give to those who wanted until I had killed the incentive of the ambitious. And what do you bet? I could get the whole states to promote gambling as the way to get rich. I would caution against extremes in hard work and patriotism and moral conduct. I would convince the young that marriage is old-fashioned, that swinging is more fun, that what you see on TV is the way it is and the way to be. And thus I could undress you in public. I could lure you into bed with diseases for which there's no cure. In other words, if I were the devil, I'd just keep doing what I've been doing. Paul Harvey, good day. What do you think of that? That was prophetic, considering when it was read. Every single item that he mentioned has come to be. It's no wonder my friend is nervous about the world that we live in and the direction we're headed in. I want to think with you a little bit today about that subject. I'm not meaning to be an alarmist, but I am meaning to be real and to think through with our minds where we're going and how Christians are to live and act and react in a world like the one we're living in. This piece was done 53 years ago. And it reminds us that Satan does have a plan. It's startling, it's prophetic, it hits home, it speaks to 2018 like you can't believe. By the way, I made extra copies of this. Probably not enough, but if you'd like one, see me after the service and I'll be sure that you get one, and you might like to share it with someone that you know. But going back to my friend who's scared for herself and for her kids, for the direction that our world is going in, what do I tell her? What do I tell myself? What does the Scripture have to say about this? Let's go back a minute to 1965. Personally, I'm 12 years old. Happy, healthy. I'm going to Oakley Junior High School on the west side. Just starting to notice girls. And I'm starting to get involved in sports. My home life is a very good one. I have a loving mom and dad and brother. We're a very close Christian family. We attend church every Sunday without fail. In the summers, I go to the cottage, and we have a dog. Life is good. But at the same time, in 1965, stuff is going on. This is the year of the hippie and the protest movement. War protests are taking place more and more as our country escalates its troop involvement in Vietnam. Marches are taking place for civil rights across the whole South. Communism is a real threat. We've just come through the Bay of Pigs, and still the Soviet Union poses a real threat, and people are scared that with the push of a button, we could get into a nuclear war that would obliterate much of our country. Riots are taking place in my high school in just a few years. Police presence is going to be necessary in the halls as racial riots break out, and the Dog and Suds up the street that used to be the teen hangout is now a sanctuary to get away from the fighting in the school hallways. All is not well in the world that I live in growing up. I have friends being beat up on a fairly regular basis in the halls of Union High School. Drugs are obviously a big part of that culture as well. The world in its own way in 1965 was a scary place. And the point I want to make in all of this is if you're a student of history, and I am, and if not, you should be. If you're a student of history, you will realize that throughout history, people have endured scary times. And I could take you down through the annals of history and talk about hundreds of eras that were scary times to live in. Let me just give you a couple. Jacob, we read about in our Bible, is running from his brother Esau. And why? Because he's afraid for his future, for his family, for his physical well-being. He's afraid that his brother is going to do him great bodily harm, if not kill him. And so he's on the run as we pick up on him in the book of Genesis. Joseph, let's talk about Joseph's world a minute. His brothers get jealous of him and they throw him in a pit, almost killing him. He gets taken to a foreign country and sold a few times, winds up in jail there, not knowing if he's going to live or die. And on that saga goes with Joseph. Let's talk about Moses. Moses' world. The people that Moses loved were prisoners in Egypt. Somehow God tapped him on the shoulder to go and rescue them. And the situation that he went into in Egypt was not a friendly one. The Pharaoh and he went round and round, and his life was constantly on the line before he led the Israelites on that incredible exodus from the land of Egypt, including the parting of the Red Sea. Shall we keep going? How about King David? Do you think his world wasn't scary? First of all, he has to come up against a humongous giant who could crush him with his bare hands. And then, having defeated him, he has to flee from Saul, who is bound and determined to use all the resources of the nation to do him in and to kill him. And that brings us to Daniel. Daniel is an amazing guy. I did a little bio study on Daniel and found out some things about him. He was, of course, an Israelite. He was born in Judah and was taken captive by King Nebuchadnezzar in around 597. He was brought 800 miles to the east and made to live in the country of Babylon, made to serve in the court of the king there. You remember the story about him refusing the food of the court and all that kind of stuff. And make a long story short, he stood his ground because of what he believed, because of his relationship with God. And ultimately, even though his life was on the line at that point, he was spared and actually was respected by the Babylonians for his stance. He was a possessor of a great mind who could interpret things that no one else could interpret, and he used that mind to the glory of God. He was promoted and placed over wise men. He had friends there who were thrown into a fiery furnace because they refused to worship the God of the Babylonians and maintained their faith in the one true God. They were, of course, spared and later respected and honored as they came out of that fiery furnace, which should have taken their lives. Later, Daniel himself, because of his advancement in the kingdom, with the other leaders of Babylon were jealous of him, and so they plotted and found a way to get Darius, the leader of the country, to throw him into a den of lions. And you know how that story came out. He was ultimately able to come out of that den of lions unscathed because of the protection of God. Daniel is a fascinating person because he maintains this integrity, and his personal devotion to God is never wavering, and he's a man of prayer, and he refuses to give up prayer, even at the risk of his own life. He lives in perilous times in a foreign country under rulers that could snap their fingers and have him, or apparently have him, killed. A nasty world, a scary world that Daniel is living in, and yet through it all, he maintains his faith in God. That brings us to that passage that Patrick just read. And that passage came to me as I was thinking about my friend who is afraid for the future. Somehow God just zeroed me in on that particular episode in Daniel's life. And here's Daniel summoned to interpret this dream, but before he ever gets there, the stage is set. And this description of this wild party that the king throws, and not only is he not just content to have a big bash where everyone gets drunk and has fun at the expense of the Israelites, he decides to go and fetch from the basement the very goblets that were taken out of the temple back in Judah when they conquered Jerusalem, and further humiliate and make fun of the Israelites and their God. And in the middle of this wild party, the handwriting on the wall. We didn't read the rest of the story, but let me refresh your memory. As they stand there, they watch a human hand writing these words on the wall, and the king is terrified by what he sees, desperate to find out what it means. Finally, one of the people summons Daniel, telling the king, there is a man, an Israelite, who has been gifted by God with the ability to determine the future and to read the signs. So Daniel is summoned and brought into this scary mess. And the king pleads with him, please tell me what this means. Mene, mene, tekel, parsin. And Daniel, amazingly, in the rest of this story, says this to the king. You've been arrogant. You knew about the way God brought your predecessor, Belshazzar, to his knees and revealed himself, and yet you have taken this arrogant stance against God and proudly defied the God of heaven.